Good morning again. For those of you who are just joining us now, welcome. My name's Chris Bollinger. I teach in communication studies, and it's my privilege this morning to introduce to you Ms. Rebecca Flintoft, Executive Director of Student Affairs for the University of Michigan College of Engineering. Prior to her current position, Becca served for 15 years at the Colorado School of Mines, most recently as Associate Vice President for Student Life. Beginning in 2018, Becca co-chaired Every Ore Digger. It's a engineering school, and a comprehensive campus-wide initiative aimed at promoting mental health, championing resiliency, and preventing suicide at the Colorado School of Mines. She served 4 years as the interim deputy Title IX coordinator, 13 years on the behavioral intervention team. She's author and co-author of the book Violence Goes to College, 3rd edition, and has written in the Journal of About Campus. She currently serves as chair of NASPA Center for Women Board. In 2022, she was awarded the Zenobia Hikes Memorial Award for NASPA in recognition of her work to support the achievement of women in higher education and student affairs. She previously worked at the University of Colorado Boulder and at Heidelberg University in Ohio. She earned her BA in chemistry and music from Kalamazoo College and a Master of Arts degree in college student personnel from Bowling Green State University. So I've been debating about whether to share this in the introduction, but I think when you do work in crisis response, you have to balance a lot of pieces, right? You have to be part administrator, part pastor, part counselor, part tactician, and you got to change that in mid-flow, right? And so professionals who do this sort of develop a kind of balance for that, a kind of signature that they take with them to everything that they do. And so whether playing her cello at the memorial service for a colleague's lost infant, providing support for a young woman who's just recently been sexually assaulted, or leading her campus response to a series of deaths by suicide, Rebecca Flintoft repeatedly leaves positive and indelible marks on the people she has helped and the institutions she has served. Please join in welcoming to the stage Rebecca Flintoft.
So I'd like to ask you all, if you would, take a few minutes, go back in your mind to your first days of college. Maybe you moved into a residence hall, and if you did, you could have met your roommate, possibly for the first time ever. So you figure out, who's gonna take the top bunk or the bottom, where are you gonna put your clothes, in the dresser drawer or the closet. But you have to figure out how to share this very small space with somebody who is essentially a perfect stranger. So a couple of days in, you're starting to get pretty annoyed, frustrated with your new roommate. You invite them to share some snacks and watch Netflix with friends, and they blow you off. Or you hang up their hoodie, which they left on the floor, you put it on a hanger, and they accuse you of messing with their stuff, even insinuating that you might have stolen something. They clearly don't trust you, and you have no idea why. So eventually, your roommate stops going to class too much. Not long after that, they drop out completely. So, the good news for you is now you get a new roommate, but the bad news for your roommate, right? And what if the reason that they had such a difficult time getting along with other people, adjusting to college courses, adjusting to campus life, what if it wasn't because they were just a terrible person and a bad student? What if they were a trauma survivor, and the impact of that trauma impacted the way that they show up in the world, how they learn, and how they make and sustain relationships? So this is what we're going to be talking about today, talking about how trauma shows up on college campuses. And I wanted to say thank you to Corey for sharing your story which of course is an amazing message of resilience, overcoming really difficult traumatic experiences. And so I might draw a little bit on some of those examples that he shared, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about me. I am not a mental health practitioner or a clinician. I do not study trauma in terms of, I don't do research on trauma. However, I have been in higher education and student affairs for over 20 years. And during that time, I have worked with probably hundreds of students, probably thousands of students who have, to some degree or another, experienced trauma. And I have led teams in student affairs, across campus. I've worked with faculty to help navigate really difficult experiences on a campus-wide level, as well as on an individual level. So, as Dr. Bollinger mentioned, working with suicide prevention, working with the aftermath of suicide loss. I've supported students who have experienced sexual assault or domestic violence, and other kinds of traumas that I'll be sharing a little bit more about today. Before we get any further, I think the thing that I want to make sure that we establish, first and foremost, is to recognize that trauma is present in this room. And I've come to realize that trauma is present in any room, in any space where I go, where other people are present, where I'm present. Because trauma is so pervasive in our society, and if I acknowledge that the likelihood is that people in this room have experienced trauma, that's going to help me do a better job of connecting with, leading, and helping others learn. Few learning outcomes, because of course, as a higher education practitioner, I want to make sure we're talking about what are we going to learn. So you're going to learn about what trauma is and how it impacts people. We're going to describe some examples of how that could show up specifically in a higher education setting. We're going to talk about the characteristics of a trauma-informed approach in higher ed. And I hope that you'll be able to leave this from whatever your perspective is, whether you're a faculty member, staff member, or a student, with some strategies that you can adopt in this setting. So what is trauma? And I'll tell you a couple of things about trauma. There's a variety of definitions and ways that trauma is understood and constructed. But what trauma is not, that sometimes gets talked about in our popular culture, trauma is not just merely discomfort with topics that we find uncomfortable. The other thing to know is that trauma impacts people differently. Trauma is highly variable. So from person to person, it's going to show up different. So this is SAMHSA's definition. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is a branch of the Department of Health and Human Services. An event or circumstance resulting in physical, emotional, and or life-threatening harm, and which has lasting adverse effects on an individual in all these areas. So that "and" is really important. It's not just the experience of a traumatic event, not the actual event itself that is trauma, but it is the event plus the impact on an individual. So you're probably familiar with, or at least have heard of, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is a mental health diagnosis in the DSM-5. So again, it's about you need an exposure to a traumatic event as well as all these other types of symptoms. I'm not going to describe these right now, but I will in a little bit. So again, as I said, trauma is highly variable. So not all traumatic stressors cause trauma effects in all people. So if you can think of this equation here, it's the 3 E's of trauma. You need the event of trauma or events of trauma, plus how an individual experiences and makes meaning of that trauma in their life. That creates the effects of trauma. So for example, you could have 2 people in a car accident, side by side, the exact same traumatic experience, or event, but yet they might experience it differently, and therefore one could have trauma or the other may not, or they might have different types of trauma. Similarly, you could have siblings that grow up in the same household experiencing domestic violence, but based on the way that they make meaning of that experience, trauma may show up differently. I'm going to give you a book recommendation. If you haven't already, I highly encourage you to read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. So he does a really wonderful, it's a beautiful book, it's wonderful to read, description of how trauma actually produces physiological changes, actually changes our brains and our bodies in very real and measurable ways. So in other words, here's some of the categories, and I want to talk about this because, again, I'm not here I couldn't offer anyone a diagnosis. That's not my expertise. I don't have that credential. But how we think about how trauma shows up. So is the loss of self. So thinking of, you might experience guilt, shame, extreme anger or rage. Numbing is very typical of trauma survivors. So the emotional distancing, withdrawing from relationships, perhaps numbing emotional pain through drugs and alcohol. The reorganization of perception. So in this, van der Kolk talks about that you might see somebody the trauma survivor might layer this lens of trauma over all experiences. Corey talked about that he had the experience of any person in any position of authority he would respond to with anger, probably perceiving them as someone dangerous, right? So in trauma survivors, oftentimes they layer that trauma on everything. So it's very difficult to tell the difference between who is safe and who's not safe, what is real and what is not real. Some trauma survivors can get stuck in trauma, and that trauma becomes the area of their life, the only area of their life that really has a lot of meaning. So we can see this sometimes with our military veterans who experienced combat trauma. And so the world gets separated into people who know and people who don't, right? Which then, again, can contribute to some of that distancing and numbing, because I've seen this on campus. Some of our veterans come back to campus, and it's like they really have a difficult time fitting in because the rest of the students, they don't know. They didn't have those kinds of experiences, so it's really hard to just make any meaning of the day-to-day life of a college student. Neurological impacts, we could spend the entire day talking about this or longer, but I think you're probably familiar with the left and the right side of your brain. So typically, the left and the right side of your brain work together, right? So the right side of your brain being the more intuitive part of your brain, it's where we store emotions, and it's where we store memories of sensations like sounds and smells and feelings, right? So, and then the left side of your brain is the rational side. It's where it's our analytical brain. It's where we store language. It helps us kind of keep track of sequential cause and effect. Well, in trauma, the left side of our brain really gets shut down. And the left side of our brain usually is where we store the words to describe the feelings that we have, or where we keep memories that we can later recall in order of the things that have happened in our lives. So in trauma, essentially what happens is a loss of executive function. It's the loss of the ability to really maintain kind of analytical thinking, memory, and so of course that impacts learning. We also see this impact, for example, working with sexual assault survivors, oftentimes when they're telling the story of their assault, which they usually have to do in order to report to the police or report to the university, sometimes the stories that they tell are not sequential, or that the way that they recall the memory of their assault is fragmented. And that's related to the way that trauma impacts the brain. And then the last one, of course, is stress hormones. Again, Corey talked about being in survival mode for a very long time. So trauma causes these heightened levels of cortisol, adrenaline, the hormones that our body produces when we are in danger or when we need to do something. I mean, I was definitely feeling some of that before coming up on stage, a little bit of nervousness. But if you've experienced trauma, those hormone levels, those stress hormone levels can remain elevated for a very long time. And so that has a lot of impact on our bodies, our physical and mental well-being. So, I wanted to share just a little bit of information about the prevalence of trauma. But what I would say is what the takeaway is that unfortunately we're all experiencing a high level of trauma in our lives. And, college students actually are at a higher risk of experiencing new trauma in college than the rest of the population. We know that there's very high levels of sexual assault on college campuses. And I think the second bullet point is important to know. Over 2/3 of youth report lifetime traumatic exposure by the time they reach college, many with multiple exposures. So, there's a lot of research out there that unfortunately many of our children and youth have experienced traumatic experiences in childhood. And for some folks, that continues into adulthood. I'm not going to talk about all these different traumatic life experiences. I'm not here to tell stories of trauma, and I'm not going to talk through all of these because many of you know what are traumatic life experiences because you've experienced them yourself. But I'll call out a few that I think are worth mentioning. The impact of abuse or neglect by a caregiver on a child has lifelong impacts. And this is important for us, I think, especially as we work with college students. The death or loss of a loved one or a caregiver having a life-threatening illness can be very traumatic. So when I think of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, over 1 million Americans died from COVID so far. So I think of all of their loved ones, right? And then think of not just those who died, but who were sick enough to be hospitalized, and the children of those folks. Worldwide, I heard over 8 million children in the world lost a primary caregiver to COVID-19. So these are extremely high numbers of traumatic incidents. I'd call out bullying. I think bullying is a really under-acknowledged source of trauma that many of our youth and, for that matter, adults have experienced. And then, of course, unfortunately, we're all experiencing higher rates of trauma, and we are experiencing more community violence and climate-related natural disasters. So I'm thinking, we know that gun violence and mass shootings are happening in our schools, communities, grocery stores, churches, public spaces. And the impact of climate disasters has impacted many of our communities, whether that's wildfires, flooding, extreme temperatures, hurricanes. So again, we're experiencing a lot of trauma collectively and individually as a society. And we have an evolving understanding of trauma too, so racial trauma is really important. We can acknowledge that racism and racist incidents have traumatic impacts on those individuals that experience them, and some of the outcomes are very similar, that sense of hypervigilance, or perhaps a sense of helplessness or a loss of hope. And then developmental trauma disorder is being studied. This is really the study of the cumulative effects of traumatic experiences among children and youth, including those things that might not be categorized officially as trauma. So for example, growing up in poverty, or experiencing neglect. These are things that we're studying. And of course, we talked about the collective impacts related to COVID and other kinds of experiences. And I think you only have to look in the news to recognize, wow, there's a lot. Our young people and our entire society, we're experiencing a lot of trauma. And we're talking about mental health, I think, in a really wonderful way, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about mental health over these 2 days with you all. I would actually say that now there's more public awareness of trauma and its impacts probably than ever before in our society. So my question for you is, those of you who are students, those of you who work in higher education, is the culture here ready? Are we ready for how do we want to create an environment where all students can be successful? Because I really do see this as an issue of accessibility and equity. That when students come into our community, and not just students, but when our faculty and our staff and all members of our community, do we all have the opportunity to be our best, to learn, to graduate, to go on and change lives. So here's some of the things that I have heard people over the course of my career in higher ed. Here's some of the things I've heard people say, and I will admit, I've said a lot of these too, okay? So, don't you know, college is the best years of your life, right? I mean, students these days, they have it so good. I mean, back in my day, it was so much harder, right? Or people will talk about, well, the good old days back when I was a student, when actually it was only the good old days for some people and not for others. Or my favorite, just wait until the real world, right? Just wait until you get out there, and then you'll see what it's really like. And what I think this does is implies that students don't live in the real world, that students don't have real lives, that they don't deal with hard things. And my experience is that students deal with hard things all the time. So, you may agree with some of these statements, and some days I do too, but I think it's not a very helpful lens for how we want to think about creating this supportive environment, trauma-informed environment. So how does it show up in college students? Trauma shows up among learners a little bit differently than maybe you might expect. So there's a lot of, as I mentioned, with the impact on executive function, there's a lot of impacts that really are challenging if you're a student and you're in a learning environment. So you might experience a fear of taking risks. That might be, I'm not gonna apply for that scholarship. I'm not gonna do that public speaking. I don't wanna join this group. It's a fear of risk taking when, again, this is an opportunity in college to take those risks in a relatively safe environment. You might see students having difficulty with their memory, difficulty focusing, difficulty keeping track of deadlines, and that is not helpful when you're managing an 18-hour, 15-hour credit hour course load. You might see students engaging in unhealthy relationships. And I've seen this a lot. And you just wonder, and not just among students, right, of course, but why are you getting back together with that person? They're clearly not good for you, right? But we see this pattern, especially among trauma survivors. We'll see, I would say the other thing that comes up the most is withdrawal. Again, it's that isolation, it's dissociation, it's a type of numbing. So I see this with students a lot, and I often have worked with faculty too who will say, I thought things were going okay with this student, I know they were struggling, that they reached out for help and we were talking, and then they just ghosted me. So I've been ghosted by a lot of students that I was helping. It's like, well, why did they just disappear, right? So many students who've experienced trauma, you'll just see they just stop showing up to class, or they stop turning in assignments, or they stop responding to emails. So, and I think that is a tough one to understand because it's not very logical. But of course, trauma is not very logical, and the way that it impacts our brains is actually that it reduces our capacity for analytical or logical decision making. So SAMHSA has helped develop this trauma-informed approach, which has been applied in lots of areas, comes really out of public health and social services, has even been applied in some criminal justice settings, and we're starting to apply in education and in higher education. So there's a lot of it, but some of the key tenets, key assumptions that underlie this are the 4 R's. So the first being realization. Realization that trauma is present and it impacts your community, and it impacts your friends, and it impacts your students, and it impacts you. I'm guessing many of you probably already have that realization. Recognize what your role is, recognize the symptoms and the signs of trauma in the community. So this is a great opportunity to partner on campus to do some training. I didn't delve very deep into that, but to really get some training for faculty and staff and student leaders on how to recognize that. Respond. So when we're starting to work from a trauma lens, we can put that lens over a variety of different ways that we respond on campus. So that can be our crisis protocols, that can be our policies, that can be the way we plan programs on campus. And then last is to resist retraumatization. So what I mean by this is that we need to use that trauma lens and look at what are we doing in our classes, in our campus experiences that might inadvertently re-traumatize folks. So this has been probably a really good example of this would be related to sexual assault reporting. And so for survivors of sexual assault, they might have had to, in the past, report their assault to an RA, to the RA's supervisor, to a police officer, then they have to report it also to a detective, then they might have to report it to, a Title IX investigator, and so on and so on. So at a lot of colleges and universities over the last 10 years, we've started to do better at that. But again, looking at the other ways that we might be inadvertently re-traumatizing folks unnecessarily. I'm just going to share a few other strategies with you. I'm not going to go into all of these. We've been talking about resilience a lot last night, and it was the theme of Corey's talk this morning. So really empowering students. So I, really think that the biggest change from high school to college is that in college, you're responsible for your own learning, right? And so I think if we can put students in that role, put them in the driver's seat, that's really helpful. Focusing on growth, so maintaining this growth mindset, it's not just about the grade, it's not just about the outcome, it's about that process over the product. And social connectedness cannot underestimate how important that is. Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas talked about this last night, right? Social connections and having that network of people that you can lean on in times of trouble. Because I know from my experience, when a student is in crisis, they're probably not going to come to me. They might go to a faculty member that they really know and trust, but probably not. Who are they going to go to? They're going to go to their friends or their family. That's who they're going to reach out to. So making sure that people have a strong social connection is probably one of the most protective things we can do for our communities. Campus level strategies, of course, we want to make sure that we're training everybody, and I mean everybody, students, faculty, student affairs staff, custodians, food service staff. On my campuses, I've seen that I used to work in a student center and there was a Starbucks, and it was the Starbucks baristas who, knew some of our students because they saw them every morning. And I'll tell you what, those were the people who could say, you know what? I see this person every day. Something about them has changed. Or faculty. Faculty have a really great opportunity because faculty see students maybe 3 times a week for 16 weeks in a row. And so you may not feel like, well, I don't necessarily know every student, but you do. You know a lot more than you realize. Making sure that folks are trained in de-escalation. So if somebody experiences a traumatic impact, we have some really basic skills on like how do you help somebody calm down, maybe do some deep breathing, and really just being with somebody and making those appropriate referrals. At the classroom level, I think, again, remembering that trauma is present. If you just leave this session with nothing more than that, I think I'll probably have done my job. And then lastly, we really need to be mindful of retraumatization, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue. So as somebody who's spent over 20 years doing a lot of crisis management, working with students through some very difficult times, and working with a community and staff through some very difficult times, I've certainly experienced this. You know, you can have over-identification with a student where you might actually, I've experienced this, where it just seems like I connect with this student because there's something, we're from the same place, we have a similar background, we have a similar story. That can also resurface our own past trauma if we're working with somebody in their current trauma. So we need to be working in teams. When I train new faculty members at my university in supporting students in crisis, the number one thing is I tell people is you should never be the only person responsible for a student. And if you know something about a student where there is a life or life safety issue there, right? You're concerned about somebody's safety. You should never be the only person to know that. So obviously working with your counseling center staff, your dean of students, working with other professionals to make those referrals. And lastly, I just really want to emphasize taking care of ourselves and self-care. So that might look like therapy for those of us who have experienced challenging parts of, everybody has experienced challenges, but that could be working through past traumas ourselves, and really engaging in that self-care and knowing when we need to set some boundaries as well. I've experienced that where I've needed to call on colleagues of mine to say, you know what, I can't make this phone call today. I can't call this parent, and so I'm going to need to I'm going to phone a friend and ask a colleague to step in so that I can take some time and focus on my own self-care. Dr. Chris Bollinger and I worked on an article a few years ago about ways to encourage deep learning with students on really difficult topics, even sometimes topics that might be related to trauma. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of strategies here. So communicating with learners. So what we mean by this is we can communicate with students in advance about what they're going to be learning. So oftentimes you've heard of trigger warnings as a way to sort of opt out, right? And now a lot of news articles, you'll hear trigger warnings or, on websites, and that's great. I think in a education setting, that's not the best approach, right? Because we want people to stay really engaged. We want students to be learning, even if it's difficult. But if we work with students and we tell them, here's what's coming up, here's what the course material is, talk to me if you're concerned about this, let's work together on this. So what this looks like is a really thorough syllabus, for one. And we don't need to be surprising people when it comes to traumatic material, things that might trigger those past traumatic experiences. We can also rethink some of our pedagogical approaches, some of our teaching approaches. So we can structure learning through gradually increasing levels of intensity, right? We don't need to just push students right into the most intense learning experience to make a big impact, right? Because that is a way to potentially trigger some past trauma for folks. But if we can work towards it gradually, we can check in with students along the way. How's it going? Gives students the opportunity to check in with themselves as they go and maybe reach out for support along the way so that they can be able to engage with maybe more challenging material as we go. Employing multiple modes of delivery. So I have an example of this. Most universities require faculty and staff to do training on sexual harassment, as well as domestic violence and sexual assault reporting. And the way we used to do this is we would take all the faculty and the staff, and we would put them in a big auditorium like this, and they'd be sitting right next to their colleagues, right? Talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. Well, if you've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace and you're sitting right next to the colleague who's the person who's sexually harassed you, that's not a good learning environment. So a lot of places have moved to those to be more of an online kind of delivery, gives people some more options for that. Of course, if we have students that we know have past trauma, maybe they survived a school shooting, or maybe we know they've shared with us their personal story that they experienced domestic violence. We can work with them proactively if we know something's going to be challenging, right? So we can work around anniversaries. If we know what's coming up, we can check in with them. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, being able to respond appropriately when somebody experiences a trigger for a past trauma. And again, we don't have to be experts at this. We don't have to be mental health practitioners. We just need to be present. So that might look like taking a student aside and saying, "Hey, are you okay? I noticed you were breathing, or I noticed you shut down, or it looks like you were crying. Are you okay? Can I do anything for you? Do you want me to help you get connected to a counselor? Would it be helpful if I check in with you tomorrow?" So I think these are really, we can make referrals, and that's important to get people connected to mental health providers, but we can also just be present with folks as they're struggling and make a big impact there. I also love to talk about these mind-body activities. I am a student affairs person, so I love to also talk about the fun things that we do on college campuses and the co-curricular opportunities. So all of these activities, actually, there is research that shows that they can be therapeutic, that they can contribute to an environment that is healing for all sorts of mental health challenges, including trauma. So we know yoga, therapeutic yoga, can be used for trauma survivors. Music and dance are wonderful opportunities, whether you like to listen to music or make music or be in a dance group or a drum circle. It's a lot of these kind of communal experiences of rhythm and music. So singing in the choir, being in a band, hanging out with friends, listening to music, being in a dance troupe. These are all really therapeutic opportunities. And, of course, they enhance all those social connections. Play and recreation, so important, not just because physical activity, of course, is good for our bodies and our brains, but also because tapping into that play is an opportunity for us to find healing. So this could be sports, intramurals, ping pong. On my campus currently, the engineering campus at the University of Michigan, there is two sets of adult-size swings right in the middle of campus. And every day I walk out there and there is a student swinging. And I promise you, have you ever seen anybody on a swing who didn't look, content or happy? So that's a really cool opportunity. Massage, so touch is a really powerful tool, or maybe chair massage. Mindfulness, I saw on one of your slides earlier that you have opportunities to do some meditation through the TLU Care website, or maybe you have a group that does mindfulness practices on campus. It's something that we can incorporate into our our daily routines. We can even incorporate it into our classrooms. And then last but not least, I mean, everybody loves therapy animals, right? So the therapy dogs, having the opportunity to connect with animals is really powerful. And on a college campus, students really, I think, love those opportunities. I've always thought that students, if you bring a dog or a kid to campus, that will, delight a student. So again, going back to this question of is higher ed culture really ready to change the way that we do things? I mean, we're a very old institution, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And I was talking to somebody last night and said, we got to remember, higher ed, it was not set up for who we are today. Higher ed came from a history of being for the white, privileged, elite men. That's where it came from, right? And we're doing better and we're changing. But it's still a very hierarchical structure. There's a lot of traditions, there's a lot of expectations, the way that we train people to be faculty members and to be students, it's so ingrained. So are we ready? And are you ready? I'm going to share with you a couple of my closing thoughts here are some of the foundational concepts, foundational ways of thinking for me. Some of them are mantras even. The first, which I've said it already several times, trauma is present in this place. Second, and this one is my favorite, I use it a lot. Every time I talk to somebody about, hey, what do you do? They say, what do? You work at a university. How do you work with students? I remind people that students are whole people, period. They come with complex lives, complex backgrounds, diversity of experience. They're not blank slates for us just to write on. They're whole people. And then last, just a reminder how important it is for each of us in every community to know that we matter. Each of us is an integral part of a community of caring and growth. Thank you.